I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and being a part of Ethanol Producer Magazine's webinar series. We'd like to thank today's webinar sponsor, Urban Air Initiative. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers and are excited to begin, starting with our moderator, Douglas Durante, Executive Director with Clean Fuels Development Coalition. Before we get started with Doug, we have a couple housekeeping items that we want to cover. The first is the panel will be fielding questions at the end of the presentation. So please write in and they'll cover as many questions as possible. Also, today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on Ethanol Producer Magazine's website in the Webinar On Demand section. We'll also be sharing a discount code at the end for people looking to attend the virtual FEW. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Douglas Durante. Doug, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Doug Durante with the Clean Fuels Development Coalition, and we want to thank everyone at BBI for helping put this on, and thank all of you for joining us, because we know everybody's busy and there's a lot going on in the fuel and agriculture and ethanol worlds. But I'm very happy to have been asked to help steer this discussion on what we think is a very critical point in time for all of us in the ethanol industry and really the entire liquid fuels industry. We're here today to talk about Octane, and Octane is a pathway to more ethanol demand and more corn grind, is a pathway to more efficient vehicles, is a pathway to solidifying the liquid fuel market. We're talking about a research octane number, which we refer to as RON, and in this case is 95 RON. There's a lot of numbers thrown around in the octane discussion, and much of the policy debate keeps coming back to this term of RON. So that translates to an octane number at the pump, known as AKI or anti-knock index, and consumers are more familiar with. But the RON is what we're talking about today in terms of where we want to go. And today's premium would be a 91 AKI with a 95 RON. So we'll get into those details. We want to make sure everybody understands that. And there's never a time in the ethanol industry where everything's sailing along and we got our feet up and things are just going great. So this is the complete opposite of that. This is a particularly trying time. The RFS is under siege. There's a constant chipping away at it from EPA, and coupled with a significant drop in fuel demand due to the COVID virus, the future is uncertain. And of course, that translates to pain in the agriculture community, which has had multiple challenges beyond just ethanol, including the recent storms in the Midwest. So you couple that with the fact that the RFS is subject to a permanent reset and management by EPA, which is stipulated in the law, and EPA is working on that as we speak. So you put all that together in the future as to what demand we can expect from the RFS is rather unclear, to say the least. You can get a RIN from biogas or even renewably derived electricity. Both of those take wet gallons out of the market, and depending on future politics, renewable diesel, electric vehicles could further elbow corn ethanol out of the picture. So we wind up with a stagnant, if not a shrinking demand. And if that permanent reset or the future volume obligations are based on fuel consumption of this year, with the volume losses we've seen, we could conceivably never get back to a 15 billion gallon conventional ethanol demand. So the question is, what other pathways to increased ethanol demand and increased corn grind might be available to us? Certainly, we've been talking about octane for years now and how ethanol is a low-cost, low-carbon source of octane, and wearing our ethanol hat, we'd certainly have to capitalize on that. So with us today to shine a light on what that pathway could be and how we might get there, or what I would term as critical legs of the stool: ethanol, auto, and oil. I've had the pleasure of working for decades with Dave Vandergren of ICM and Coleman Jones of General Motors, more recently Keith Mueller of Flint Hills Resources. And Flint Hills is unique in that it is a refiner of petroleum products, which is an important leg of that stool, but at the same time, the fifth largest ethanol producer in the United States. Everybody in the business, in the ethanol business, certainly knows Dave. I want to make sure that they also know Dave is an Iowa farm boy, and he comes at this from the perspective of helping agriculture and preserving the family farm and providing a clean fuel that protects our health and that of our children. ICM has built more than 100 ethanol plants, been a champion of the ethanol industry in many ways, including supporting me at CFTC and our organization, but creating the Urban Air Initiative, which is doing groundbreaking technical work to get to higher blends. Coleman Jones is also known to many of you and has been a supporter and advocate for ethanol within General Motors for years. He's working with us now to try to find the right combination of things that we can do, technical policy levers we can pull to meet their needs in what's an ever-changing regulatory landscape. And GM has been at this a long time. They were the first automaker to honor warranties for ethanol. And so this is not a passing fancy for them. They know higher ethanol fuels can help them increase efficiency. They understand the value of ethanol and want to be able to use it. Keith, as I noted, represents a major U.S. company with interest in petroleum and ethanol. And it's actually not that unusual. I go back to the early days of the ethanol industry. We had Sunoco, Texaco, Marathon, and others had ethanol plants. And of course, we have Valero and others today, along with Flint Hills. So Keith is going to give us their very important perspective and his views on moving ahead, given they don't want to see ethanol devalued. They want to see it as valued as we do. And he shares our collective need to preserve the liquid fuels market. So with that, I will stop and let's start with Dave Vandergren and let Dave give us his perspective on where we need to go from his side. We welcome and encourage questions, but we're going to answer them all at the end of all three of the presentations because there will be times where all three panelists would want to chip in on the answer. So let me turn it over to Dave. And again, thank everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Doug. And I appreciate all of you that took time out of your schedule to be a part of this webinar. And we hope that what we have to share here will be of value to you and helpful as we look to what our opportunities are. As we go to the first slide, what you see here is what I believe the RFS has reached its maximum benefit and is really no longer an industry growth driver. The chart shows the gap between supply and demand representing about 450 million bushels of corn. However, ignoring the trend lines, production and demand have been stagnant since around 2016. Our two largest export destinations for this gap are Canada and Brazil. And Brazil is now producing over 400 million gallons of corn ethanol, and they're now back in the U.S. and international markets. They previously were a 400 million gallon a year customer for U.S. ethanol. And Brazil will continue to grow because they are profitable at around $2.50 a bushel corn. And they will dominate the international markets for both corn and ethanol in years to come. Future ethanol demand growth must capitalize on ethanol's octane value. Together, we can make a higher quality, greenhouse gas reducing, more beneficial consumer gasoline. As we've seen in the past, money always looks to where the momentum is. In 2005, ethanol had momentum, and money was available to build plants. Today, EVs have momentum with tax credits and money flowing into their sector is reducing the demand for liquid fuels. However, there is an opportunity to show the momentum of EVs by capitalizing on the octane value of ethanol in the gasoline blend, along with its replacement of the most toxic components of gas, which are aromatics. Over the last 15 years, refiners have lowered the aromatic content of gasoline by 8% when blending ethanol to achieve the required octane levels. This is by far the most economical source of octane, and we have the opportunity to capitalize on that with a higher octane fuel standard. We have an opportunity at hand for sensible fuel reform legislation that benefits all stakeholders. Legislation moving the nation to a 95 RON minimum standard provides a potential 20 billion gallon yearly opportunity for ethanol and over 1 billion bushels more corn demand. The security automakers need to make more efficient engines, and Coleman will speak to that later on. And it gives refineries an efficient method of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from liquid fuels and slows the decline of liquid fuel consumption. According to a recent study authored by Ford engineers and published in Energy and Fuels, a 95 RON minimum standard is projected to raise ethanol blending to around 18% nationwide, thus reducing our dependence on exports, which are also on the decline. Extending the life of the internal combustion engine is good for all stakeholders. Some of the discussion points where we have consensus with all the stakeholders are E10 as a base fuel, 15 billion gallon floor. So when you look at the chart, the floor is higher than we are achieving under the current RFS program. Tier 3 cert fuel contains 10% ethanol and is used by the auto industry for the past 2+ years. Refineries can vary the percent of aromatics, saturates, olefins to their discretion, since they are all components of gasoline cert fuel. We should be entitled to that same rule, since ethanol is also 10% of cert fuels. However, EPA has chosen to restrict ethanol to 15% max and E85, which starts at 51% ethanol. This rule leaves a gap from 16% ethanol to 51% ethanol, where ethanol is not approved as a consumer fuel. As an octane additive to gasoline, ethanol is 10% of the nation's certification fuel today, and indisputably substantially similar to test fuel and test fuel additives. Fuel reform must legislate that ethanol is defined as substantially similar, what we call sub-sim, and not limited to just 15%. An octane standard establishing labeling parity and standardized labels for all blender pumps. Over the last couple of years, we have learned that consumers only care about octane and or the price. If they can buy a higher octane fuel at similar pricing, they will choose the higher octane fuel. The 14 Jumpstart C-stores in Wichita, Kansas sell more E30 than they actually sell E10. Why is that? Not because it contains 30% ethanol, but because it is cheaper and has more octane, and they are getting better performance. Jumpstart does not promote ethanol. They promote octane and price. Of the 300,000 gallons per month of E30 sales, the majority is probably going into legacy vehicles, and we have had 0 complaints. Hardening is a term used by the auto industry to validate service life for various components of a vehicle. At over 6 million miles a month of 30% ethanol with no known or reported issues, this should tell us that the cars on the road today are hardened for blends above E10 and E15. An interesting point is that premium in Wichita sells at about 50 cents over regular. And you may ask, well, why is that? And I would answer that because they can. Can they make a 95 RON with premium? Absolutely. Will they? Probably not. It would cost them over 10 cents a gallon to use a 10% blend to make 95 RON compared to a 17% ethanol blend to their current Bob. Currently, we anticipate that E10, 87 AKI, would meet 95 RON using E20 or 20% ethanol. Approximately 50% of E10's current refinery Bob blend stock could also be certified to meet 95 RON with E15. If refiners lower the Bob octane for E15 back to 87 AKI, finished gasoline, we anticipate most Bobs can certify to meet 95 RON with E25. Tier 3 vehicles, which is model 2017 and newer, could be approved by EPA for up to E25 under sub-sim, and that in turn would reduce toxic emissions and improve efficiency with reduced CO2. This is a big deal for the autos to be able to further optimize their fleet. EPA's unchecked control of ethanol consistently works to limit and cap ethanol's market. We expected EPA's RFS reset and anti-backsliding study to support negative ethanol bias at the EPA, and it did. Back in 2012, the deputy director of the EPA told me to my face, "We hate corn." And that bias permeates the majority of EPA career staff who have no connection or understanding of agriculture. EPA is contracting with the petroleum industry to define the fuel composition used to calculate toxic emissions has resulted in ethanol being blamed for the emissions coming from toxic aromatics. Talk about the fox guarding the henhouse. Since EPA refuses to regulate octane or fine particulate from the tailpipe, our only alternative is legislation. EPA is not a friend of agriculture, and we must move past them if we want sustainable agriculture for this generation and the next. RFS loses bargaining power every day, a result of EPA's unchecked anti-ethanol point of view. RFS has reached its maximum benefit. RINs are not driving more ethanol blending. EPA will not regulate octane. An octane standard solution must be legislated. Meaningful reform will take the pen out of EPA's hand. None of us will get everything we want, but all of us can get what we need. If we all are willing to unify our efforts and compromise appropriately. Our industry is a part of the liquid fuels industry, and we need to come together as an industry if we expect to extend the life of liquid fuels and the internal combustion engine. At this time, I would like to pass it off to Coleman Jones with GM.
Hey, Dave, thanks very much for that. That was a great introduction and a great initial set of slides. Let's see if I can run this thing. All right, there it is. Okay, so high octane fuel is a foundational enabler for fuel economy. Most of you weren't around in the First World War, but back then octane was only 50 and compression ratios were 4-to-1. Things have improved a lot since then. We're up to 10-to-1 compression ratios and octane 87 and higher. But at the same time, we've had to improve fuel economy, and we've done it for many years, but we're now being required to increase it at a much faster pace. You can see in the blue circled area, this is the slope that we have to achieve for the Obama standards, which is going to require us to improve our fuel economy from the low 30s to the mid 40s in just a few short years. The early parts of this program, circled in red, we haven't even succeeded in achieving that. The industry as a whole has never met this curve, and we have used credits from past performance. High octane fuel and high compression ratio internal combustion engines are a critical slice of the improvements we have to provide in order to meet these requirements. And high octane fuel increases the efficiency of all internal combustion engines, including future engine technologies and hybrid electric vehicles. There's been a lot of talk, as Dave's mentioned, about octane. It's been going on for at least 10 years. And one of the prime discussion points is, what should the future octane be? Let's give you some perspective from the automakers. 98 RON, which is favored by many, is not available in the western half of the US or in Canada. And since future vehicles will not be flex octane, the correct octane must be broadly available. And a 98 RON future requires waiting until this fuel is available throughout the US and Canada. Further, mid-level ethanol blends are needed to support a national 98 RON standard at an acceptable cost. Getting up to a 98 RON using straight hydrocarbon is going to produce a fairly expensive fuel that may not be welcomed by the public. And the historic growth rate of mid-level ethanol blends throughout the US has been slow and indeed non-existent in Canada. 95 RON standard with a 98 RON performance grade is a lower risk approach. 95 RON provides great opportunities for E15 and E20, and a 98 RON opens the door for higher blends as mid-level blends proliferate. So this is a slide that I borrowed from Dave Hirschfeld at MathPro. It shows his survey of premium octane throughout North America. It's important to recognize here that the pool average fuel has to be higher than the indicated value, because you have every gallon has to meet the standard. So if you make your fuel to be, for example, 95 RON, exactly half of your fuel will be off spec. You have to have some octane giveaway to ensure that every gallon meets the spec. But back to the slide, you can see that the US is divided into pads. The East Coast is pad 1, the Midwest is pad 2, the Texas Gulf Coast area is pad 3, Mountain States are pad 4, and the West is pad 5. And Dave has done us a service by circling areas that are not 98 RON. And you can see that the Western Midwest premium is only 96 RON. In the Western oil patch, it's only 96 RON. The whole Mountain States, it's 96 RON. And then on the West Coast, it's 96, 97, or even 95 RON. And Canada and Mexico are also below 98. So these are areas where we really couldn't offer a 98 required vehicle because the fuel isn't available. Now let's look at the build out of mid-level blends. The important question is how long to get to one station in 7. And by the way, this isn't very ambitious. It's less than the current diesel availability. You can see on the chart on the lower left the sprinkling of E15 stations today. And you can see they're not uniformly spread. They're concentrated where you would expect them in the Corn Belt and also in the upper Appalachia. Large areas of the Deep South have pretty thin levels of E15 stations, and indeed on the West Coast and the Northeast, there are no E15 stations. If we look at the growth rate in the blue dots, we will see that the historic trend points to it taking an awfully long time to getting to one station in 15 or one station in 7. And even if we look at the last 3 years where things have improved markedly, it's still going to be a long wait until we get a good penetration. And just because we have a good count of stations doesn't mean they're uniformly distributed everywhere where they need to be. So let me give you some conclusions. Automakers face daunting fuel economy challenges. The SAFE rule runs through 2026 and will mostly have to be met with current fuels. And there's a real possibility that it will be flipped back to the original Obama standards, either by the courts or by a new administration. The Democrats' Solving the Climate Crisis proposal calls for 6% annual increases in fuel economy. The US and Canada are one market and require a common fuel. Current high-octane fuel vehicles are typically performance vehicles that have reserve power. I'm pretty confident that if you put regular in your 638 horsepower supercharged Corvette, you can still get around just fine. However, future high-octane vehicles will be tuned for fuel economy and will have no reserve power. The correct fuel must be available throughout the market at the start of sales. Mid-level ethanol blends are needed to support a national RON standard at acceptable cost. Now, we can wait until 98 RON mid-level ethanol blends are available throughout the US and Canada, but it might be a long wait. I think it would be better to proceed with a lower risk approach. And a 98 RON standard with a 95 RON standard with a 98 RON performance grade is the low risk approach. The 95 RON provides great opportunities for blends like E15 and E20, and the 98 RON opens doors for higher blends such as E25 and E30 as mid-level blends proliferate. And let's not lose sight of all the other things that are needed here. There's legislative opportunities beyond Octane. Legislation can address all the blend barriers: the vapor pressure waiver for all blends, preemption of state barriers, vehicle capability, retail contract limitations, price display, product liability for retailers, T50 revision, which is an arcane limitation in the fuel specs. Many of you think the MOVES model needs to be corrected. Fuel life cycle models need to be updated every year, and there's improvements that need to be made to certification fuels and calculations. Many of these are going to be very hard to get through regulation, but they can all be addressed through legislation. Thanks for your time. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Keith. Take it away.
Thanks, Coleman. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks everyone for signing in today. Let me see if I can get to my first slide here. There we go. It says, what do refiners want? But let me first say that I can't speak for all refiners. I can speak for Flint Hills, and we think we have a pretty good understanding of what refiners want because we're a large refinery as well as a large ethanol producer. So what we think refiners really want out of any type of fuel reform legislation is business certainty. Regulations are temporary. They swing with every administration. They take forever to implement. Legislative reform, we think, would create greater certainty, and if done well, could optimize the performance to extend the path of the internal combustion engine. And that's what we all would like, is to make sure that we give the consumers a product that increases mobility at the best choice for them. We are not afraid of electric vehicles as long as we can compete head-on-head with them and not compete with a subsidized mandated electric vehicles. We want to keep compliance costs low. Right now, the RIN is a subsidy, and the RIN prices are a poor subsidy for increasing ethanol blending. What do high RIN prices do? They don't do anything to support more ethanol blending, but what they do is bring a bunch of unwanted political pressure to all members of this community with little or no impact on ethanol blending. The EPA will take over, as Doug said, the tables in RFS. And what are they guided by? They are guided by 6 vague, broad, subjective factors that are in the Clean Air Act. Those factors can be subject to political interpretation, and the outcome is going to be driven by the influence of whatever administration is in power. So which goes right back to the number one, it doesn't provide business certainty. One of the things that the EPA is even considering is using the existing RFS to grant support for e-RINs, or creating RINs for charging electric vehicles. So right now, the way we see it is, while the liquid transportation industry is fighting over little battles, we're losing the war. As policymakers at all levels, local, state, and federal, are subsidizing and mandating alternatives to liquid transportation fuel. There is a better path for consumers, for every one of us. But as Dave pointed out, it has to be better for all market fuel participants. We firmly believe that the 3 legs of the stool are ethanol ag, refiners, and the auto OEMs, the auto manufacturers. We think that if anyone puts forth a legislation that only benefits them, a wish list legislation, that one of the other people that don't like that has the ability to stop it. Our system of government is set up that if everybody agrees, it's hard to pass legislation. And there's a lot of opportunities to throw a wrench into the cogs of how legislation get passed. We think for success, it has to be a competitive platform that offers a better value proposition to consumers. So consumers have to win. We have to reform distortive legislation to be as close as free market as possible. We believe that the market is the best arbiter of decisions and not the government. There is no regulation or legislation that is really free market, but we hope that we can put forth a proposal that moves us from where we are today to something closer to market. We need to keep compliance costs low, to keep the unwanted attention away, and we need to eliminate the unnecessary barriers to competition. We think to do this, you can take advantage of the efficiency benefits of optimizing a fuel with known engine technologies. Coleman talked about compression ratio. We talked about octane. This new high performance fuel must be available on a nationwide basis in large quantities at a reasonable cost the moment the first consumer buys the first car. It has to be available day one or it's not available. And as Coleman pointed out, there's large areas of the country, like even California, that doesn't allow 98 RON, doesn't allow E15. So we need a fuel nationwide. We think 95 RON achieves that. As Dave pointed out, ethanol is the economic octane choice. Couple complicated graphs. I grabbed one from RFA that actually tried to show exactly what I was showing in my more complicated graph. But what I did is took a theoretic gasoline blend, tried to make finished 87 AKI gasoline, the regular that everybody buys at the pump. I took the Bob price and says, if I have an 83.5 octane Bob price and I want to make 87 octane fuel, I have three choices to do that. I can either blend alkylate, which is a high octane component that the refineries make. I can blend reformate, which is something similar, or I can blend ethanol. This is the cost difference of ethanol's advantage over the last decade of blending an ethanol 87 finished versus blending an alkylate or reformate. Dave talked about 10 cents a gallon. This shows it's an average of about 12 cents a gallon. I can tell you right now that octane costs to refinery are precious. Our refineries, we're making as much octane as we can. If we needed to make more octane because the market demanded more octane, we have two choices: blend more ethanol or put capital on the ground to make more octane in the refinery. Refineries are under tremendous pressure. There's a lot of them shutting down right now. They've been in the news, permanent shutdowns. If I went to my board and asked for a $300 million capital project to make a product that's more expensive than the market alternative, I'd get laughed out of the room. 12 cents a gallon may not seem like much, but the way retailers fight for a penny a gallon at the street corner, the way activist shareholders are demanding fiscal prudence from many of the people that they follow, 10 cents a gallon, who in the market's going to win if they decide to offer a fuel that doesn't take advantage of the cheap, high-octane ethanol? So how do we think we need to increase ethanol blending? We think we need to use the RFS, the existing RFS, to transition it to solve the barriers to blending. Oops, I don't know, I hit the wrong button, sorry. We need to invest in retail and other infrastructure to fix regulatory or legislative barriers to blend. We're told that one of the barriers to higher level blend is the retail infrastructure. So how can we use the RFS to invest in that? We need to transition away from a mandated fuel structure to allow the market to demand more ethanol in the form of its inherent value of octane. We think 95 RON standard achieves this. Every year that the automakers sell new vehicles that only can use 95 RON, you have a guaranteed increased demand for octane, and we think that increased demand is for ethanol. How do you fix the program? Right now, the program is nested into a whole bunch of different things where one biofuel can solve the compliance obligation to another. We think the program needs to be denested. We think that ethanol has different needs than biodiesel or advanced biofuels or cellulosic. So design a program to meet the specific needs of each of the different types of biofuel. And as Dave said, reserve the conventional 15 billion gallon mandate for grain-based or conventional ethanol, and based on some type of performance standard that if you achieve certain performances and actually blend all 15 billion gallons, those standards may fall away or be guardrails to allow backstop of blending. The 15 billion gallons, as Dave pointed out, has never been achieved. Even with extremely high RIN prices, it's always easier to import a little bit of biodiesel to solve your compliance obligations than it is to blend more ethanol, because the cost to blend more ethanol means you have to find an extra demand node. Finding the extra demand node, we believe, means in fixing some of the retail infrastructure, the barriers to blend. Why we think legislation would do that. Next thing, require all vehicles that are optimized and hardened to reflect the high efficiency of 95 RON and the potential fuel blends that could satisfy consumer needs. So harden the cars, make it a law that you have to have cars that have used the high octane. We have to ensure that the adequate service station infrastructure in place to meet demand, need to keep compliance costs low, and we have to specify how this program would work in legislation, not regulation. Tell the EPA what to do, as opposed to, letting the EPA figure it out on itself. We know that the RIN doesn't drive investment. A couple months ago, I was sitting on a panel with the Ag Auto Ethanol, and a Casey's general store guy was on the panel, and he was asked a direct question: does high RIN prices incent retailers to change infrastructure? He's absolutely not. The RIN is so volatile, I could never take to my board a capital project to increase the capability to put mid-level blends in place with that volatile structure. So RINs, by definition, are a bad incentive for solving some of the barriers to blend. The other thing why we want to denest some of these things is, I don't know if everybody's seen the announcement, there's a tsunami of announcements that refiners are converting to renewable diesel. With over 4 billion gallons of announced new capacity addition, that accounts to close to 7 billion RINs. We really believe that if the program stays the same, those RINs will flow over into the conventional bucket and actually push out the ability for ethanol to achieve higher level blends. Let's see, next slide. There you go. So what do we want? What is our ask? Our ask is for everyone on this call to be open to evaluate proposals to see if they make the ethanol industry better off than it is today. Think RFS is a great slogan, but the RFS, the way it's currently designed, is top dot for ethanol. It's complicated. There's a lot of unintended consequences. We propose a solution that does not repeal the RFS, but takes it away from the EPA discretion and makes it work for the intended stakeholders. As I talked about E-RINs and other things, currently the RFS can be manipulated or distorted to directly subsidize alternatives to liquid fuels. I don't know if you saw the latest headline, but I put it here on the bottom of the page. And a Wells Fargo economist thinks the biggest threat to farming is the electric vehicle. We think one of the other big threats that is coming out of Washington and one of the states these days is the proliferation of low carbon fuel standards. Most of these low carbon fuel standards want to use low carbon liquid fuels as a transition to 100% electrification and 100% EV penetration, and to phase out the liquid fuel industry. We've talked to our refining counterparts and believe we have an understanding of their needs such that we can broker a solution. However, we need the biofuel and ag community to engage with us in meaningful dialogue, get in a room with detailed legislative ideas to hammer out a compromise we all can live with. We think there's an appetite in DC to solve the problem, because I don't think anybody's very happy with all the little battles and skirmishes that go around the RFS. So I'm going to leave you with a couple things. One, we think a legislative solution is required. Regulations are temporary. Legislation can create more certainty. And I want to leave with one last question. Does anybody believe that ethanol would be better off in the future with those that want to end liquid transportation fuels altogether? Thanks, and I'll turn it back over to Doug.
Well, thanks, Keith, and Coleman and Dave. Great information, great perspectives, lots to think about and chew on there. We've gotten a couple of questions in while you guys were talking, and so let me start with a few of those. But Keith, one of them is when you mentioned a 15 billion gallon figure, 15 billion gallon volume rather, but based on a performance standard. Can you expand on that just a little bit? And I mean performance in terms of delivering the fuel or performance of the fuel itself?
Yeah, it's a great question, Doug. Let me be a little bit more clear. What we are proposing is that the 15 billion gallons is preserved for the conventional ethanol, something that is not the case today. Although many talk about 15 billion gallons as an ethanol mandate, let's face it, it's a conventional fuel mandate. Ethanol has never achieved 15 billion gallons. The balance has always been made up with other biofuels like imported biodiesel. The performance standard portion is a concept that the 15 billion gallon obligation is preserved for only conventional ethanol, but any shortfall in actual blending automatically creates funds to invest in higher level blend infrastructure, which we believe is to be the constraint. The 15 billion stays in place until those investments in a market pool for octane result in actual 15 billion gallons of blending.
Okay, here's one that really actually was either any of you could answer, but Coleman, let me give this to you. The Keith's list of elements of a new approach talks about vehicles that are required to be optimized and hardened. Dave mentioned that in his presentation, that there seems to be some real world proof that the vehicles can handle higher blends. But just as a technical explanation for those of us, what were we talking about? We're talking about an optimized vehicle and a vehicle that is hardened in order to meet these higher blends.
Thanks for that question, Doug. Let me start with hardened. A hardened vehicle is a vehicle where both the parts that are exposed to the fuel have been designed and validated to use the fuel, where we're confident that that the parts will last the life of the vehicle in contact with the fuel and doing whatever it is they do with the fuel, injecting it or burning it or what have you. And that's what we did when we moved to warranty 15, is that the vehicles are made with components that we have demonstrated in our test labs are going to live the life of the vehicle with the fuel. That doesn't mean that other vehicles won't also survive the fuel. It's just we don't know that because we never tested those components. So we're not willing to warrant them. Now, when you talk about optimization, there's really two levels of optimization. One is where if the fuel, we have an octane standard come in, we would increase the compression ratio of the engine to take advantage of that octane and gain engine efficiencies. And as part of increasing the compression ratio, we would recalibrate the engine, looking at injection timing, spark timing, valve opening and lift, things like that. As time rolls on, we will be able to do further optimization, which is where we would be able to reflow the engine, which is looking at airflows and things like that further increase efficiency. Since an engine running on a higher octane fuel, if you have the same engine, you put higher octane fuel in it and higher compression ratio, it's going to make more power. So we would then be able to downsize the engines in order to meet the same acceleration, etc. goals. And then finally, you can recalibrate your transmissions for improved efficiency because your octane is higher and your compression ratio is higher. Your efficiency map is different, so you will end up changing your transmission calibration in order to spend more time in the new high efficiency areas of your map.
Well, let me follow up on something that actually is my question, but it follows very well with what you just said. But your reference to a 95 standard, but with a 98 performance grade. Could you explain to us what on the performance grade, what exactly you mean by that?
Well, there's a real market for performance vehicles in this country, and people have a history of wanting more. Some people have a history of wanting more performance and being willing to pay for the fuel. And we have sold our supercharged D8s as 93 AKI or 98 RON required. Nissan also sells some vehicles there, and even all the rest of the quote premium required vehicles are requiring higher octane and higher cost fuels that deliver better performance. So when all the fuels move up to 95, we believe that performance cars will then leap to the next level, which is 98.
Okay. Well, here's one that came in for Dave. Dave, you were at the heart of the building boom when plants were being built as fast as you could get the materials. What's the industry's capabilities with respect to expanding current capacity and building new plants?
Well, I think it comes back to a very simple supply and demand. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of demand, and the industry came together and got the plants built. I would hope that the next go around we're a little bit more conscientious about matching the expansion of capacity with the increased demand. To go to a 95 RON today, we actually have enough fuel to do that. We have enough capacity, we have enough resources, but we can continue to expand existing plants and/or add a few new ones here and there as the demand for ethanol increases. And at this point in time, I am not a believer that we can rely on exports to fill that void between supply and demand right now. Because as I stated in my presentation, Brazil is growing at a fairly fast rate, and they just have, when you can grow 2 crops on an acre of land, you just have much lower production cost. The only thing that's protecting us right now is the fact that they don't have any infrastructure. They don't have any rail. They don't have the ability to get product out to the ocean as economically as the U.S. can. But we do have to remember the best thing we can do for agriculture is use what we produce here. We've seen that in the petroleum industry. When we can use what we produce here within this country and reduce our imports of petroleum products and consequently our exports of dollars, that is good for the U.S. economy.
I want to remind people to feel free to use the dashboard where you can type in your questions, because we've got several coming in. One is a follow-up actually to what you just said, Dave, that came in is, why aren't we hearing more about ethanol plants that produce a wider slate of products like biochemicals, bioproducts, a wider slate of things that would, and you would think, endear us to the environmental community a little bit more. It just seems to me we're not quite as much about biochemicals and bioproducts like that. So I think I understand this person's question. What's the prospect as corn to get into that field as well?
I think to take a page out of the petroleum industry's playbook, I mean, they started just with a crude unit making gasoline and some diesel fuel, and then they moved into plastics and all kinds of other things that they can make out of a barrel of oil. That same opportunity is here for ethanol. We are still in our infancy compared to a lot of other industries. We're really 20 years, in the last 20 years is when it really took off. We are seeing that. We just completed a plant here in Colwich that is designed to make additional products and higher protein distillers grains and separating out the distillers grains. And a lot of other companies are doing the same thing. Those opportunities will come, but bottom line is you have to have a sustainable base industry, which is the fuel ethanol industry, if we want to have the resources and the ability to make other products out of that bushel of corn.
Well, I think the petroleum example is a good one. Obviously refinery makes an awful lot of different products. And speaking of a refinery, Keith, this is one from me to you. But you talk about alkylates and increasing reforming as a way to get higher octane, and why ethanol would be a better bet. Wouldn't you also get a significant carbon benefit from that? I mean, aren't these the most carbon intensive parts of the refining process to get up to the premium grades? And wouldn't ethanol, if the models were fixed and if some of these other calculations were done correctly, wouldn't that be an additional value for ethanol to work into the equation?
As I said, thanks, Doug. We believe that to increase octane with the refining process, you're going to have to put capital in the front, incremental capital investment in reactors and that rearrange the molecules at relatively high temperatures and pressures. So yes, those things take energy and does increase greenhouse gas emissions, but they're expensive as well. A typical refinery alkylation project is over $300 million to produce around 250 million gallons of a 96 RON alkylate. So with a 95 RON standard, and you have base octane of a lot of the other molecules in the high 80s or in there, how much 96 do I have to add to make everything 95? I have to add a whole hell of a lot. So that 250 million gallons doesn't go too far. Contrast that with one of Dave's 120 million gallon ethanol plants that's producing ethanol at 125 RON. So way less ethanol can be used to raise the octane pool than alkylate, as well as the carbon advantages you're talking about.
Well, that leads to another question that really for all of you, and what do we need? We know that ethanol is, the models need to be fixed, that if EPA simply used DOE's GREET model, it would put a whole different value proposition on ethanol for carbon. And we've got the MOVES model, the emissions model, that's given us problems because we don't think that's accurate. But what do we need to do? Is this legislation that we're talking about, is this the place to try to get all this done in one fell swoop?
I'll take that first. We believe it is. We believe that by nicking and picking at different little battles, nobody's going to pick up fuel reform legislation unless it solves problems for all constituencies. If we can go together and offer the Congress a solution to some of the bickering that's been going on and taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room, I think they jump at the chance. And so I think all those type of things you mentioned, Doug, should be included in legislation.
Well, Coleman, I know you've had those on your lists over the years as well, but your colleagues in the auto industry, are they with you on this? Where are they on this? And is that part of your wish list as well? Because we know that if you want to use that as your source of octane, not only as a source of octane for octane's sake, but if it's reducing carbon, you want to get credit for that. How do we do that? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, it would be nice to get credit for that, but I think our goal straight away is to get the octane in and get the octane in at a price that isn't going to alarm consumers, and we think we have a pathway to do that. But that's one of the reasons why we need to work on the barriers to blend. Now, historically, EPA hasn't given us any credit for the lower carbon properties of ethanol. On the other hand, they don't charge us for things that happen with EVs. So, there's different viewpoints on this. And indeed, their view is that the benefits of ethanol are already captured within the renewable fuels within the renewable fuel standard. So I think from our perspective, we just need to push ahead with the octane and getting the new vehicles on the road.
Right, and you're saying that the reward would be the increased efficiency, and it just makes it easier for you to meet requirements. That makes sense. But there was a lot of discussion at one point about prorating FFE credits, that were for E85, which a lot of us argue is not the most practical way to use ethanol, prorate those for E30 or E20 or whatever it is we're using, and you get more value out of it. So I know that's the kind of thing.
Yeah,
Keith, talk about
there's certainly a pathway explained in statute where you could do that.
Yeah, well, I know that the Alliance has commented on that. Here's an interesting question that's kind of near and dear to my heart, because many, many, many years ago we worked on this. It's a unique question in today's context, but someone has asked, what about ETBE? And specifically, what would ETBE do as a tool to reduce aromatics? And I guess let me throw that first to the refiner in the group. And but we're all familiar with ethers and ethanol, as ETB was a very popular notion 15, 20 years ago, but not much since MTBE was pretty much eliminated. But Keith, what's your take on that?
We've studied ETBE and taken a look at whether it's an economic choice, and it, without it being mandated or subsidized, and don't see how the economics work. I know Japan has decided to go down that path instead of blending straight ethanol. And so that's really where the global market is right now for ETBE. But it's been a couple of years since we've looked at it, so I'm not 100% up to date.
They use a lot of ETBE in Europe too, because it's a convenient way. You can put your bio component in at the refinery and pipeline it. You don't have to worry about hauling ethanol to the terminals and blending there. It can all be done at the refinery, and you can pipeline it. But in this country, we have an aversion to ethers, and I think it would be a real challenge.
Well, that's my feeling, and I know that one of the things that kept it from happening in the old days, when there was a tax exemption for ethanol, it didn't apply to the ethanol that was put into ETB, so it totally skewed the economics. But and then, of course, all the ether problems happen. I just thought that was an interesting question to come up at this point, and specifically for aromatics, and because that's a direct connection for ethanol to replace aromatics, and we've done a lot of work on that. But then there was, of course, the World Fuels Charter that at one point preferred ethers. But again, that was before the MTB problem, so I think we're back to conventional blends. Let me do another sweep here and see if there's any other questions. But any other comments from our presenters you guys any points you want to make sure we leave the audience with? And I think we've gone through most of our questions. Oh, here's one. I'm sorry, Coleman. Here's one for you. What kind of timeline could we expect to see cars that would ultimately be approved for a 98 to 100 RON, which is an E30 kind of a blend? So if we're talking about fairly short term for 95 RON, what would be the point where we have that cert fuel and you guys or your industry is okay with that octane being met by up to 30% ethanol?
Well, let's look at timings for automakers. Currently we're at the end of the summer of 2020, and we, as an industry, are building our 2021 vehicles. We are preparing to certify our 2022 vehicles because we get our cert paperwork done by the end of the year, so that the agency has got time to do whatever it is they do before they give us our certifications in time for us to start building the 2022s next summer. We are doing our development on 2023 vehicles today with the prototypes. So those prototypes are already built. And we're preparing to build the prototypes for next year, the 2024s. And we're developing powertrains for 2025. So it's a pretty long lead process. And if we were talking about going to the E25 and E30, it's a bit more work than going to E20. But I think we're looking at 2025 model year, and that's assuming we can get things tidied up here pretty quickly.
Okay.
But Coleman, this is Dave to follow up on that. I mean, we're really talking here a 95 RON fuel, and all cars are capable of running on premium today. If they can run on regular, they can run on premium. So if there was a 95
any octane above the minimum.
Yes. So if it was out there, you just would not be quite optimizing it yet to the degree that you could. And that would follow on later. Is that a fair statement?
Right. And 95 is easier. I mean, Doug's question was about 98 to 100 and E25 and E30, which is more work. A 95 run at the lower ethanol level we should be able to do that faster. But again, I'm not the guy who calls the shots.
Okay.
Well,
and one final comment I'd like to make before we finish here. This webinar was not intended to solve a problem. This webinar was intended to present an opportunity where the refining industry, the ethanol industry, the auto industry, ag industry come together and really say, what does a win-win look like? What is an opportunity for all of us to have a runway that extends down the road of peace? And I personally believe that if we come up with a better fuel, we come up with a better automobile to utilize that fuel, take advantage of it, and optimize, we all win, and we extend out the runway for liquid fuels. And in fact, if they actually tracked the electric vehicle like they tracked the internal combustion engine vehicle, I think we would be extremely competitive with them with an optimized fuel. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to, how would you say, kind of lay down our swords between each other and say, hey, we all need to be on the same team if we're going to win the game.
Okay, well, we are on the hour, and we've had great attendance on this webinar, and people have stayed for a very long time. We got some good questions, and I think it's getting to the point where we've done enough for today. But we want to thank everybody for tuning in, and any of us are available for follow-up discussions, and that's really what we need to do. As Keith said, you got to engage. Unfortunately, in this era we're in, it's a little tough for conferences being canceled and whatnot to have that, but we need to keep communicating. And because I do think, I will close with my thing, I do think the time is right. I think that there's opportunity. I don't think it's not sustainable to keep butting our heads, as Keith and we've all mentioned on the RFS. I mean, there's just flare up fires, and we may win some battles, but I don't feel like the war is being won. There is an opportunity with all this talk about decarbonization to make sure that ethanol and liquid fuels are part of that, and there isn't just an assumption that this is going all electric, because that's simply not practical. So we got to figure out a way to get together and keep this discussion going. But for now, let's call it a day. And again, thank everyone, and thank BBI for giving us the platform to do this, and thank Urban Air for sponsoring this.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you to all of our panelists for being on today. And definitely thank you to Urban Air Initiative for sponsoring today's webinar. We did, as promised at the beginning, we do have an exclusive discount for all attendees. You can use the code FEW webinar when registering for the FEW. We do hope you join us September 15th through the 17th to continue the discussions that are happening today, and join us on our virtual event in September. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and a lot of these discussions will still be able to happen during inside our virtual platform. So again, we hope you can join us for that event. We also this was recorded, and we will be posting this in our on-demand section on ethanolproducermagazine.com, so you can get that if you want to review it again. And then also, if your question wasn't answered, we will be sending that to the panelists, and someone may be reaching out to you regarding your question. So again, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.